Wonderful, welcome to week 4 of Intro to Visual Communication. Today we will talk about human perception. So we will briefly introduce some neural underpinnings of behavior from the perspective of basic psychology and neuroscience, and we will investigate how our perception can be related to the ability to communicate appropriately in the context of the class, but more in general in the context of human communication. So the subtitle is Perspective in Neuroscience and Psychology to address specific attributes, aspects, and structure of the way we see and interpret the world around us. Now, for this lecture, I really encourage students to review the PowerPoint posted on our system, and I will review some of the basic concepts associated with each slide. All right. So visual perception is the main thing of the first part of our conversation. So visual perception, of course, has to do both with our ability to see something, and from the neurological perspective, that has to do with our visual cortex right here in the back of our brain, the occipital cortex. But also it has to do with perception, the ability to grasp a concept, okay, perception, okay? The same as conception, ability to grasp something in togetherness, okay? Perception has this more immediate body matter-based component to it, okay? Think about perception as is the perception of our senses, for instance, okay? So this has to do with the way we see the world, all right? It has to do with the way we see the world, and also the way we represent the world in our minds, which really means through our retina and in our brains, how we can reconstruct images. Now, we mentioned this before when we talked about construction and deconstruction, and we will analyze that concept even more so in week 4 through 8. But the element to keep in mind here is that there are existing things out there, but we are recreating all these things in our mind, okay? So there is both natural machine body matter-based function in that, which is neurology, really, where our brain interprets stimuli, but it's also a socially constructed element because we interpret things based on what we learn about those things in the context of history of society and so on, all right? Now, a few things here from the PowerPoint. Keep in mind that sensation is extremely important and related to perception. 70% of our body sense receptors reside in our eyes, okay? Now, it is true that our strongest sense, we could make the case, it's our sense of smell, our olfactory bulb, because of its ability to completely or almost completely bypass passing the thalamus and going straight to our cortical activating systems, so to our cortex. It might be the sense that has the strongest power to push us in one direction or the other. And yet, from the perspective of visual communication, we really want to pay attention to our eyes, the way our eyes interpret the world, okay? We very often utilize the sense of sight in a figurative sense, okay? When we use sentence starters or reflections such as I see. When we talked about having a sense of insight, we talked about the Age of Enlightenment being illuminated, okay? The luminaries of certain disciplines, okay? The Illuminati of certain pseudo-historical, pseudo-scientific literature, okay? Now, it is also important to understand that our visual cortex does not work alone as a separate entity and neural structure from the rest of the brain. This is true for all other cortex, all other cortical parts as well, all other lobes in our brain. So the visual cortex allows us to perceive the world, visually speaking, but of course everything else in the brain, and for sake of time, I will just focus on the prefrontal cortex. This is the part of the brain that allows us to add cognitive and even emotional meaning by communicating with the limbic system and I am attaching a brain diagram in this context to further explain this concept here, right? So is our eye, the human eye, a camera like the one I'm talking to in this moment? Yes, but with a very big B. So it has a camera in a sense that it has the capacity to perceive the world, to zoom in and out, which is of course related to the selective component of our eyes, but it's not just a camera in terms of visual perception, okay? Its selective filtering ability is modulated and predicted upon both singular subjective component as well as cultural and socially constructed components as well, okay? Now there is a field which is the field of psychophysics that attempts to connect whether it's out there in terms of physical simulation in a qualitative sense with perceptual events, okay? And thanks to this field, we can tell a little more about the way we see the world at the level of sensory perception. So this is something that I cannot explain right here on camera, and therefore I encourage students to take a look at the PowerPoint and see how you can relate to that. And there are a lot of visual tricks, so to speak, visual experiments here that I attached to the to this slideshow, and there's a vast bibliographical reference list that you can play with. So I will skip a few slides here, but the general concept here is that we can interpret the world based on previously assimilated information. This is true for repetition, for size and depth, perspective, proportion, all of the above. So the context gives an added meaning that will really switch the interpretation of what we see in the world, okay? Now, this is true for still life images, it's true for movement. There are changes in luminescence, changes in the curves between highlights, midtones, and shadows, between an over or underexposed image, what type of characters the image has, whether there is a certain level of saturation or desaturation, how crisp the image is, whether is there any filter, and I'm thinking about the meaning-making differences in basic programs such as Photoshop or Lightroom, for instance. Okay, now there are optical illusion as well, for which I refer to the PowerPoint, but optical illusion are also predicted upon the utilization of certain images that our eyes and therefore our brain has been exposed to in the past, and therefore has learned how to react a certain way. Okay, there's a wonderful website that I include here, Michael .de, D for Deutschland, Germany, with OT for optical illusions, that really advises students to take a look. Okay. Now, a few things that I like to quote here: pre-attentive processing. Certain basic visual properties are detected immediately by low-level visual system. Pop-out versus serial search. Tasks that can be performed in less than 200 to 250 milliseconds on a complex display, and eye movements take at least 200 milliseconds to initiate. Now, there's another example here from Healy, 2005, that has to do with both the fact that color is pre-attentive, so the ability to detect the differences in color, and conjunction of attributes. Now, images become more meaningful to us in the capture of attention also based on whatever is happening outside, so the background and kind of noise. Okay, so I made a quick list here in which you have number, curvature, size, you have length and width and height, orientation, hue, closure, intensity, what kind of motion, movement, direction the image has, whether there is a specific depth of perspective, whether the image is 2D, two-dimensional, or three-dimensional, whether there's an intersection, whether the outside of the image are a certain way and they're different from the inner side, and what type of attention ability our eyes has. Okay, now something that I like you to remember is the law by Weber, or Weber's law. Ratios are more important than magnitude in stimulus detection. And I'll read for you, hopefully you can take a look at the image here. For example, we detect the presence of a change from 100 centimeter, a meter, right? 100 centimeters to 101 centimeters with the same probability as we detect the presence of a change from 1 to 1.01 centimeter, even though the discrepancy is 1 centimeter in the first case and only 0.01 in the second, okay? So think about the ratio as the primary element here, okay? And I will refer to the bibliographical reference for the specific discussion and application to the equation of the Weber's law. Another component from the perspective of perception is the JND, so the just noticeable difference. There is an image here of two somewhat equivalent squares, both gray, but there is a difference between these two. Now, this is also something that I encourage students to do on their own, because it's really hard to detect that on the screen, even if I share the image here with you. So I'll advise this. Now, another element of Weber's law is the fact that most continuous variation in magnitude are perceived as discrete steps. And again, this has to do with the background. So how perceptual is the change in intensity of these gray areas, okay, as you move from a very dark circle to a much brighter one, okay? And also the component of this separation, this integral versus separable dimension, okay? I quote a word by Ware here. Now, I mentioned in previous slideshow the concept of Gestalt in connection to shape and form, okay, from a psychological perspective. What is so important in the context of visual communication? Well, it is important because whatever we perceive is perceived in juxtaposition, sometimes in opposition to the background, or to anything that is similar and, again, juxtaposed, put in a similar situation, background, or environment. So whether they're similar, whether they're different, whether they're symmetrical, whether they're connected, whether see-through, transparent, whether there is a clear separation between the main character, the main figure, and the background, and so on. There are a few examples here as well in the PowerPoint, so I really encourage students to take a look here. Another website that I utilized for this PowerPoint is www.aber.ac.uk under Media. So for this perspective, I simply want to say that in a class on visual communication, we had to spend a lot of time understanding what communication actually is and how to utilize it to deliver a message, and also how we perceive the world from a very basic neurological perspective, the perspective of visual perception. Thank you very much, and I will see you all next week.